So welcome to Module 8. We're going to talk about feedback, assessment, and grading. And I put this little line in the bottom, I focus on learning and the language of learning, because ultimately our kind of overarching goal when we're doing our feedback, and we're doing our assessment, and we're doing our grading, is we want to ensure that our students are learning what we want them to learn. Where to start? So in our Distance Learning Playbook, there's this nice kind of just graphic organizer to help you frame your thought process when it comes to assessment and if your students are learning. So you have feedback to students, which we're going to talk about, formative evaluation, summative evaluation, and grading. And kind of what are your goals? So when you're talking to your students, you're providing feedback, what do you want them to get from that feedback? And the evidence of your success is you know that your students listened and digested and worked with your feedback. How? So I like this because it was just a nice place to frame how I would like to frame my thoughts when I was going into the scenario you guys are working in right now with how do I actually make sure my students are getting what they need to get. I'm providing solid feedback, and what does that look like? So feedback to students should really be constant. We want to help them close that gap between where they are and where we want them to be. We want to make sure that they know where they are in their learning. So we don't want students kind of drifting off in space for weeks on end, thinking that they're learning what they need to learn, and then boom, they're hit with this huge test and they had no idea what was coming at them. So we want to give them lots of places to receive feedback and work on stuff so they know where their learning is. We want feedback to be timely. So we want it to be something that is recent for our students. It needs to be specific and personalized. So just saying you did a great job is vague. What was great about it? Was their thinking great about it? Did they solve it using the method that you wanted them to solve the problem? Did they tap into their prior knowledge? So make sure that you tell them exactly what was good about it. When they're doing something that maybe isn't so great, tell them, yeah, I saw that you started by factoring, but our next step was not to graph it. Maybe we should look at setting it equal to 0 or solving it like an equation. Feedback should address where you're going in terms of the student. So you want to know, the student should know where they're going, where their end goal is. How are they going to get there? So if they're stuck solving an equation and they just don't know where to go, then we need to tell them, this is our prior knowledge. We can look here. Here are some different techniques we can use. And where will you go next? So what's the student's future actions? So after we kind of hit this learning goal, factoring is going to lead you to finding the zeros of these 5th degree polynomials. So letting them know that the learning they're doing now is great and how it's going to support future learning. When you're giving feedback, a lot of it is going to be contingent on the relationship that you've built with that student. So we want to make sure that we're fostering great positive relationships with our students, and we're focusing on the great things that they're bringing to the table and not spending too much time talking about the negative pieces. We want to combine the feedback to making sure we're talking about their cognitive and motor skills. And so the social and emotional pieces, we want to kind of limit that. We want to provide feedback, but we also really want to focus on that learning and making sure that we keep that relationship intact. We also want to focus on creating an environment where we expect errors and we celebrate them. There are places where we can learn and we become better learners because we have made mistakes. Formative evaluation, we want teachers to be checking throughout the lesson. That way you're not surprised with your student learning at the end on how they do on your summative assessment, and your students aren't surprised. We always want to know where our students are, kind of doing a temperature check of the room. It helps you make decisions for your next step in teaching. So maybe your students did really great at exponents and they remembered more than you thought they would. So you can scrap the next lesson and move forward with talking about negative exponents. Or maybe they absolutely remembered nothing about solving equations. So you need to take a step back and revisit inverse operations. For students, they really need the feedback. So that's what's very valuable to them. So just getting a D on a test isn't always great. They understand I didn't know it, but they don't know what they don't know. So if you can have a moment to go over the students' results with them, that'll help them understand where their gaps in learning were and how they can take actions to be better next time and maybe hopefully fill those gaps with knowledge. There are lots of different types of formative assessments that you can do, and these are just the few that were outlined in the Distance Learning Playbook. If it's underlined, then it's hyperlinked. You can talk about virtual exit slips that help you gauge student understanding. So maybe it's a direct question about the content that you went over. Maybe it's just a thermometer, a temperature check to see how the students feel about the material. You would want to review and reflect on these results, provide remediation and intervention as needed. Story retellings. This was, I thought, nice for elementary folks, but also some of our EL kids as well. So retellings allow your teachers to determine where a child is, taking away the burden of kind of reading the text to them. It can be informational, it can be narrative text, but letting your students tell you what they learned in class. So just meeting students where they are, but still allowing them to demonstrate to you that they did learn. Other options, so you have Kahoot. If you've done a Kahoot, those are quite fun with your students. And this is just a link to 7 different ways to do formative assessments, just kind of creative ways. Practice tests are just short quizzes to check for understanding. They also are going to get a little bit of deliberative practice in there, kind of trick your students into practicing those skills. We want them to be kind of low stakes and not necessarily part of the student's overall grade. We want them to focus on gaining an awareness of where they are and how they can support their current learning to get to their future learning. Feedback is really important in this step. So we want to make sure that you're giving your students consistent, timely, specific feedback so they know where they are and where they should end up going. Summative assessments are going to be at the end of the unit. If you are doing BLA right now, you know that the struggle is real when it comes to making sure that it's a nice the testing environment is nice and secure. If you're assessing in the classroom, there are still struggles because you're looking at using 1 year or 2 days for an assessment. So we just have to be creative with how we are assessing and what we're trying to assess. So maybe we're going to make shorter assessments this year. If we are testing in the virtual environment, shorter exams, doing it in a live session. Get familiar with Google Classroom and Google Forms. A lot of our publishers have ways that you can link an assessment straight to Google Classroom. So that's a nice little option to kind of investigate. And maybe just think of alternate ways to assess the learning in your class. So moving away from maybe just traditional tests to doing portfolios, or maybe the student is going to do a flip grid, or maybe there's going to be a narration that's going on. Making sure we're assessing their learning and they're still doing what they need to be doing to be successful as they continue on in their education. But just being aware that it is a tricky time for everybody right now with doing these types of assessments. There's a movement towards doing competency-based grading. So you're going to focus on mastery, and you're going to not do as much focus on the practice work and non-academic behaviors. The idea is that it would encourage students to learn the value of practice, and that would allow them to master the content. So we're trying to create little students that know that we have to do homework for the value of doing homework because it supports your future learning, not just for a compliance grade. So coming from high school world, I know that is very difficult. Students who are not demonstrating mastery would then be required to attend different tutorials, maybe do an alternate homework assignment or do the homework for the first time, take it before they could take another assessment to demonstrate mastery. This is a very tricky thing to implement. It's also called standards-based grading. The idea is that with time, most students learn the value of being an active participant in their education. Research has shown that relationships between teachers and students are healthier because the idea of the non-academic grading is kind of removed. A lot of teachers do add another component of a citizenship grade to go with the academic grade. So that would kind of be where your compliance piece comes in. But like I said, this is difficult to integrate, but it is a nice idea to bring into what we're assessing of our students right now.